Hello, warriors. So, we're going to be wrapping up Unit 9 today. You'll take an assessment for me on Monday of next week, and then that gives us the rest of next week and a little bit further to finish up the 20th century. So, today, what I'm going to be talking about is imperialism in the 19th century. Now, normally, this is a topic where I really like to dig in and take some time and sit with it a little bit, but situation being what it is, and me having the time that I do have, I'm going to try to kind of like hit the highlights, make sure that you know the general talking points here, and move on from there. But I don't want to skip over some of the stuff that is a little bit structurally esoteric here. This is the sort of thing that a lot of people just kind of skip over. They'd rather talk about like the scramble for Africa and what happens in China with regards to imperialism. And for me, while that is really important, that's Googleable information, okay? That's a Wikipedia article that you can read pretty quickly, and I'm going to have you do some work on that in a bit. But what I really want to do today is I want to think about what is imperialism and why does it happen on an intellectual basis? Like, what makes a group of people think that it's okay to take over about a third of the globe? So to start off, we have a political cartoon here, and the figure at the center, this is a cartoon figure known as John Bull. John Bull is sort of like the British version of Uncle Sam. He's kind of their visual stand-in for the British Empire. And you can see he is this creepy looking like octopus thing that is grabbing everything, right? He's reaching out here for Egypt. He has a hand on India. He's got Ireland kind of tangled up in his coils right here. Trying to read which one that one says right there. Can't really read it. He's got a hand on Canada, on Jamaica, on Cyprus. He's got Cape Colony over here, Gibraltar, Borisland. These two, Cape Colony and Borisland, right here, that's South Africa. He's reaching out for Malta. So the implication in an image like this is that Great Britain is this octopus that is like taking over the world, that's trying to cling on to everything. And that's not an inappropriate way to think about what Great Britain did at the end of the 19th century. Now, the first thing I want to do is kind of hit some definitions here. So imperialism, we've actually already talked about way back in Unit 2 when we talked about what an empire is. So if an empire is a group of people who, a group of subject peoples who are different, being dominated by one political entity, imperialism is the policy by which a stronger group of people, a stronger country, usually militarily in terms of strength, attempts to create an empire by dominating weaker nations, either economically, politically, culturally, or militarily. Now, we're really familiar with the idea of military imperialism, where like you move your troops in and you occupy the land, but you can also have an economic imperialist system. I mean, like, dude, if you go to Beijing, there is a Starbucks on the corner of Tiananmen Square. Like, we're there. If you think about everywhere that there's McDonald's, like, that could be viewed as economic imperialism. People argue over that sort of stuff, but there are different forms of imperialism. But part of the reason why we talk about imperialism right after we talk about industrialization is because the two are tied together. As European countries industrialized, they were looking for raw materials that they could use to feed their factories and natural resources, things like coal, things like oil, rubber, all of the sort of stuff that you needed for industrial production. So Great Britain industrialized first, and they were looking for all of these things: cheap labor, new markets to sell their manufactured goods. So Great Britain industrializes first with the textile industry and then later with heavy industry. And that meant that they were one of the first groups to jump in on imperialism. So some of the images I'm going to show you here, or that I usually show in this, are deeply disturbing, and I'd rather not. This one's pretty mild in its racism. it's there, it's definitely present, but it's not nearly as blatant or as disturbing as some of the stuff that I usually like to talk about in class with you. And given that I can't be there in order to kind of like shepherd you through stuff and help you answer questions in an appropriate way, I'm going to edit those images out of this presentation, just because I want to make sure that we really do kind of like think about things critically and reasonably before we jump into any conclusion. So European imperialism during the 19th century was motivated by a number of ideologies. When we talk about ideological motives here, what we mean is like, what ideas did people have that quote unquote justified what they were doing? Okay. So one of the biggest ideas here is the hardest one to swallow, and that is one of European cultural superiority. That it was good to go and conquer other countries and to make them part of an empire, because then you brought European, quote, civilization to them. To people who were, quote, I have to keep saying quote because you can't see me doing air quotes, they were bringing civilization to people who were, quote, uncivilized. And that is a lie, and it is a gross one. Hopefully what you've understood through this course, especially given what we talked about in Unit 4 and 5, talking about medieval Africa and the Americas prior to colonization, is that civilizations existed outside of Europe. They did. They do. They are remarkable and complex and beautiful things. And there is no one place in the world that gets to claim that they have the correct version of civilization. But during the 19th century, this was a very common idea. It was in fact enshrined in a really famous poem called The White Man's Burden. It's by a guy called Rudyard Kipling. You probably know Kipling, even if you're not aware of it. He wrote another book called The Jungle Book. And Kipling's poem basically says that it's the obligation of white people to go out and, quote, civilize other people, even if other people don't like it. There's a lot of debate as to whether or not that poem is sarcastic or not, because Kipling very clearly changes his perspective later on in his life. But regardless, a lot of people took it very, very seriously when he said that. And so this phrase, the white man's burden, became kind of a rallying cry for European imperialists during the 19th century. There was also a complicated element here with regards to religion, because you had a lot of missionaries in Western Europe who saw imperialism as a means by which they could, quote, save souls, that they could go and convert people in Africa to Christianity, that they could bring Anglicanism into Africa. Remember the Protestant form of Christianity coming out of England, or that they could spread other Protestant faiths. It was mostly Protestant during the 19th century. It wasn't Catholic so much. That was earlier. And so that this was seen as maybe like a justification. Like, oh, it's terrible that we're going over and conquering different people, but we are bringing God to them, so it's acceptable. For me, that becomes a very complicated idea, one that doesn't place a lot of value on native faith and religious practices. This is an idea that I have a difficult time with. But the idea that is perhaps most disturbing to me is one known as social Darwinism. So, social Darwinism is, in my mind, pretty inexcusable. Excuse the random, bullet point there. We'll get there in a moment. But you should already be very familiar with Darwinism because you took biology last year. So Darwin, as you know, came up with a set of ideas that eventually becomes understood as related to the evolution of species. This theory of evolution basically states that over time, over large-scale time, species evolve to better suit their environments in order to be able to survive and thrive. So, the most famous of Darwin's work was published in 1859, right at the height of the Industrial Revolution, and the book was called On the Origin of Species. He was actually looking at a set of finches on a number of islands in the Galapagos, and he was looking at essentially how the shape of the finch's beak differed depending on the food source available to the island. The primary purpose of this text was really to talk about animal evolution, but he does point out that at the end of the book that man is an animal, and therefore if this is happening in birds and in lizards and things like that, then it stands to reason that it is also over time happened to man. And that was just like an absolute nuclear bomb going off in the scientific and religious fields. And we really haven't seen the end of that explosion since. But Darwin's ideas were related only to biology, but many people took those ideas out of Darwinism, out of biology, and tried to pull them over into explanations as to how society works. Now, this is not how anything works in terms of science. You do not take ideas from one discipline and just yank them across a barrier into the social sciences. Society is not a biological organism, but social Darwinism basically said that society was like the natural world, and therefore people who were best adapted and most successful in their given environment would survive and thrive. And that was good because people who were therefore unsuccessful would die before they had children, or their children would die, and this would end up improving the human race as a whole. This idea is really distressing because it is tied to two very, very dangerous ideas, and those ideas are eugenics and scientific racism, which I'll explain in just a moment. So social Darwinism basically said, look, if people are poor, if they're of the lower class, if they're badly educated, if they're sick, or if they have like a physical disability, that's because they are somehow less suited, less fit than everybody else. And therefore, it's okay if they die. I want to say that again. Social Darwinism basically says that if you're poor, it's because there is something innately wrong with you. That there is something wrong with you, and that therefore your struggle, your inability to succeed is acceptable. Because if you were to succeed, you would pass on those, quote, weak genes to other people. So according to social Darwinism, it's okay to let poor people suffer. It's okay to let sick people die. Because if you intervene, if you give them charity, if you provide government supplies to them, that sort of stuff, you're only encouraging them. Now, here is my interpretation. Many people disagree with it. But social Darwinism provided people with an excuse not to be bothered by the growing economic disparities that occurred as a result of the Industrial Revolution. It gave people an excuse not to feel bad about the inequalities that existed. They could just chalk it up to that's the way the world works. But the world is something that we make. And political structures and economic structures are things that we build, not natural forces. And so I very much disagree with this interpretation, as did many people in the 19th century. Charles Dickens, a very, very famous 19th century author, very much disagreed with this. If you have ever watched any version of A Christmas Carol, think about Ebenezer Scrooge. Ebenezer Scrooge is a social Darwinist. He very clearly says in one of the early parts of the book, well, if the poor are going to die, they better go ahead and do it and decrease the surplus population. And it's very clear in Dickens's writings that that is a bad response. Like, that is immoral. That is wrong. And so this is a discussion and a debate that we still hear a lot of today. What is our obligation to the poor? What do we owe to each other? These are big questions. And I'm going to pause right here and move on to the next video, okay? So I'm going to pause, and then we're going to move on from there.